Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming in today and packing the room. We're like well past the fire code at this point, thanks to you. And no surprise, because Amy Sadao is a great reason to come out on a cold evening. Thank you all so much for being here. For folks who just walked in, there's still a chair over there and a chair over here. And many of you already know Amy Sadao deeply personally, but at the same time, some of you are still new to her, and so it's such a joy to be able to have her here today to share her work and her practice with us. I'm Janine Tang. I'm an assistant professor here in art history and visual studies here at the New School, and my department is so proud to be able to have Amy share her practice with our students and a larger community here today. I also just want to briefly give thanks to the folks who helped put this event together. So Young Yoon and Neil Greenberg from the Arts really supported this event, along with Ileana Sapero, and thank you guys so much for that. The event was also put together by administrators such as Odelia Lucius and James Melson and Philippe's recording. Thank you so much. Also building today's program, we talked with a bunch of folks who also gave knowledge and time. So I also want to thank Ann Butler, Steve Lamb, Nelson Santos, Anthony Elms for sharing thoughts and insight. And we have a number of images tonight that are courtesy of visual aids, especially Esther McGowan, Tracy Phoenix, but also the New School Archives, courtesy of Jenny Swadosh, and the ICA Philadelphia from Robert Cheney, Riley Veselowski, and Jill Katz. And I want to mention all of these people because it really testifies to the impact of Amy, right, on larger communities and institutions that people would really want to rally and share thoughts and insights with us as we built up to today. And many of you know Amy as a very beloved and influential curator, educator, writer, and leader in contemporary art. And this is why we want to learn with her here today at the New School. And she's made profound contributions as the Daniel W. Dietrich Director of the Institute of Contemporary Art, Philadelphia, between 2012 and 2019, as well as Executive Director of Visual Aids between 2002 and 2012. And she continues to make crucial change happen today as Program Director for Denniston Hill and the Curator for the Columbia University MFA Exhibition, as well as a board member of the Asian Arts Initiative and the Leeway Foundation. She's also been notably honored for her work by Art Table in 2014 for the New Leadership Award. She's been a Women in the Arts leader, honored by Christine Quinn, Speaker of the New York City Council. And my favorite, she has been knighted by the Imperial Court of New York, the city's oldest drag house, for her work as an AIDS and art activist. Do I call you Sir Sadao? That's probably like the best honorific one could have, I think. And so as we were talking, building up to tonight's program, Amy asked this question: what would a feminist, anti-racist, queer, and trans art museum feel like from the inside, ? And it's that space of that question and the question mark that we hope to inhabit together today as we walk through a number of Amy's projects and contributions to the many queer art worlds that we all collectively inhabit. And one thing I just wanted to also open with is a quote from a curator who worked with Amy, Steve Lamb, to just set the tone a little bit for tonight. In Steve's words, Amy makes the institution bend to cultivate communities that would probably not cohere, perhaps even survive. She's always supported artists from her early days at Cooper Union to visual aids to ICA, but not in an instrumentalist philanthropic way. She's the badass punk bizarro version to Agnes Gund or a Dominique de Menil. And it's funny to even put Amy in that same sentence as those two, but Amy's sense of humor and audacity inspires me to do so. Amy has made it her job and her duty to care for artists that matter, and she does this by reforming and deforming cultural institutions, encouraging them to build better infrastructures of support and repair. And I don't think I could describe it quite as well as Steve, which is why I wanted to open with his words and maybe take you back, Amy, to an earlier moment. Thank you so much, Alina. Circle. Wonderful faculty here at Visual Studies, helping us out with tech. But yeah, we're taking you back, Amy, to this moment in 1997 and 1998. Yes, to a moment where you curated a show here at the New School.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
was the last show curated for Godzilla, the Asian American Artists Network. And it was a real honor, I think, to be able to work with the late amazing curator and executive director Barbara Hunt, later Barbara Hunt McClanahan, and we co-curated this show called Fermented. And it was at the invitation of an artist, Carol Sun, who sort of took me under her wing when she met me and just said like, oh, you're another Asian American kid who's going to Cooper Union. And I was interning at the Whitney at the time, and she was teaching there, and she introduced me to a lot of the artists that had formed this great Asian American network to advocate for the inclusion of Asian Americans in the curatorial field, the museum field, and specifically the artwork of Asian America, particularly as made by Asian artists. And yeah, Barbara was just really extraordinarily generous, and it's like I learned how to curate and do studio visits alongside her, and she wanted me to be the sole curator of the exhibition. I remember her telling me in her amazing British accent, like, I have a lot of curatorial experience in London and New York, Amy, and you don't have any, so you should be the sole curator. You need to build up your CV. And I just thought that that was amazing that she would give up credit that way, but I also declined since we were doing everything in collaboration. But we came up with this idea of Fermented from sort of like a multi-viewed idea of what it could be to see some things transform under fermentation, and even to become like less desirable to, or unpalatable for some.
Alina, maybe we could have the next slide as well. You know, because this is your press release at the time of your description of like that desire to like seek out like that unpalatable aspect of fermented, the challenge to the tastes of the art world and society that often looks to ethnicity as a colorful flavoring to bring to the table now and then.
Well, I think something we talked about earlier about fermented too was thinking. Do you know, I think even as we were a culturally specific artist group through Godzilla, we had a critical lens thinking about the ways that multiculturalism had been taken up in sort of cultural and particularly visual arts circles. And, you know, the idea of tokenism in particular, or, you know, I mean, these were like very 90s conversations, right? And in forming a group that's based on our identity, are we pushing, you know, are we further marginalizing ourselves and others? But I think Barbara and I just shared the experience of feeling often very tokenized in arts, in contemporary art circles, and very exoticized as Asian Americans. She was Asian British, and it was something that, as we did studio visits too, we could see was not a unique experience from the artists and other members of Godzilla.
Alina, maybe we could have the next slide. Yeah, I mean, I think that speaks to the necessity, right, of like Godzilla's mission as like a cultural advocacy organization that also allowed like experience sharing and networking between artists and cultural producers of the Asian diaspora. And like your and Barbara's experience is so fundamental to that. At the same time, you did the show in 1997, 1998, and so this is like quite a few years after Godzilla started, ostensibly around 1990 and 1991. Do you think you could speak to like what the differences were between like the time of its initial forming, but also that moment of like 97, 98 when you guys were doing the fermented show?
And I think we have some slides too. I mean, so you have to sort of place this in like a late 90s context, and Godzilla is being formed around the time of the Decade show. And what are these? These are, oh, this is this great letter that Godzilla wrote to Thelma Golden. Like, as a thank you, right?
Yes, as thank you in 1990.
Godzilla's archive exists in the Fales Library in the downtown collection, so you can go and dig around there. But there's also, I think we have a slide up here, there's going to be a wonderful show that one of the members, another young curator who was very active in Godzilla, Herb Tam, is putting together for the Museum of Chinese in the Americas that'll open in the spring.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it would be a nice place to touch down on this very influential organization. I just felt like, and I think when I look back on this being one of the very first steps that I took into the New York art world, or the art worlds, plural, I just feel really lucky. And like I said, I was very much taken under the wing of older artists who recognized me as someone who was being trained as an artist at Cooper Union, but wasn't necessarily going to make art, and who was interested in the ideas, particularly around the construction of race and the way that race is represented in contemporary art, and the way in which, the kind of difficult work that artists of color have to do to create a position inside art history or inside a critical art context.
And that position, it's so great that you mark how, even though you were trained as an artist, you didn't necessarily go on to prioritize making work yourself. And Godzilla held a space for you to do that too, right? As an organization that, supported curators, like Eugene going to be like the first Asian American woman working in the Whitney Museum. Like that was part of Godzilla's advocacy efforts, that people of color should also be in the museums, making the shows, connecting to artists of color, and so like you were held within that, and it feels like that was something that you try to hold for other people moving forward too.
I hope so, but I did really feel like there was, I think there's two groups of artists who were among the first professional artists that I met. One were the Asian American artists of Godzilla, and so people like Michi Itami and Lin Yamamoto and Paul Pfeiffer really became like role models in a certain way, and sort of opened doors, but also just for the fact that they took me very seriously, like that they allowed me to curate, they allowed me to come into their studios, to talk to them about their work, and they were willing to share their experience specifically working with the Asian American Artists Network. And the other group of artists, that I met through Barbara Hunt and Joy Epasala and Carrie Yamaoka were HIV positive artists and artists working around HIV and AIDS. And so that was like that was sort of like the gateway, the way that I entered into a lot of New York art.
Speaking of that, I just wanted to like throw up a couple images, right? Because you just mentioned like the Decade show a few beats ago, and like that was an image of like the Science Equals Death project that was in the Decade show when it was presented at the New Museum, and also like the work of Godzilla and other groups also holding the experiences like of Asian American artists and API artists living with AIDS, responding to the AIDS crisis, in also like in collaboration with Visual AIDS in 1991. So at the moment that you arrive at Visual AIDS in 2002, there's been like a decade of like that foundation being built that you come in to build upon. And so maybe we could move to that next slide.
Well, and I think also, identifying as Asian American and growing up in a really a kind of hostile, white suburban upbringing in the 70s made me very conscious of my identity. But, when I was at Cooper Union, this was in the early 90s. So this is before, when we think about AIDS, this is before antiretrovirals come out in 1996. So there's no medicine for HIV and AIDS. And I was at Cooper Union, and ACT UP was meeting in the basement of the Cooper Union. And I remember one of my roommates would attend, like the Monday or Tuesday night meetings. But it somehow, like, my privilege as, like this kid from the suburbs and going to this art school, and all of my identity really kept me unaware of what was happening in New York, in the world around HIV and AIDS, until later when I met people involved with visual AIDS. And I think at the time through Barbara and other people, I met people like Jeff Hendricks and Sir Rodney Sir and Stephanie Nagorka and other members, artists and arts workers who were board members or members of visual aids. And when I was gigging, like doing everything from cocktail waitressing to being, like working in design firms and doing research for artists, And the board from Visual Aids had gone through a transition with their director, and they asked me to step in as the interim.
And then you started. And I wanted to just throw up a picture of the slides,
I know,
registry and slide archive, and maybe you could just speak to what the support was for artists at the time you joined and how you started approaching that.
Well, Visual Aids was a really small organization, but it had been founded in 1988 by a group of arts workers, and then immediately artists started working with them. And their initial concern was to activate the art world to respond to HIV and AIDS. And then almost immediately, so they came up with some really amazing projects like Day Without Art, and actually the Red Ribbon, which was a collaborative artist project. So it's often I think that it's always really hard to represent a history of collaboration around production and imagination, but I think that that's kind of an amazing thing to talk about here at the New School, or here, like with some Parsons students, about what a collaborative artist project can do and the way that it can change perception in the world and, kind of change the world. So just that. But when I got to Visual Aids, Nelson Santos, who's sitting in the front row, had been there for a couple of years and had just come off of working on a town hall, thinking about, is visual aids necessary? And kind of the overwhelming response from artists in particular was like, yes, it is, but it was going through a real difficult time in its organizational lifespan. So it was deeply financially under-resourced. I mean, it was like literally running in the red. And that had put kind of the stops on all of the programming that they had been able to do. Mm-hmm. And so we slowly, with like great help from an extraordinary board and wonderful volunteers and totally motivated artists and friends, built that back up over years. But the archive itself, and this is also sort of like placing us back like in the 80s and the 90s, back when we used to use 35 millimeter slides, and you would like look at them through a loop or hold them up to the light to see the images, and everyone was always like documenting their work on slides. And that's where the archive project at Visual Aids began. The idea of losing the record of artists who were dying from AIDS, losing their contributions, was like a double death and a double loss. And so volunteer artists and arts workers would go into people's studios and keep a record, basically, of the work. And to this day, Visual Aids continues to do that. So artists who are HIV positive, as well as the estates of artists who have died, who are HIV positive, can have their work documented and added into this growing archive project. And one of the early projects was, how do you take this slide library, which is probably still a slide library in like these 3 or 4 donated filing cabinets, but though it's digital now, and at visualaids.org, you can see a great selection of work, and really Nelson Santos was behind making sure that digitized like over the 10 years that we worked together at Visual Aids. But when it was just a slide library, we couldn't, we could invite people in to do research for it, but we couldn't take it out into the world. And so Stephanie Nagorka and Sir Rodney Sir curated and came up with this lightbox idea, and we moved it around town and up and down the Eastern Seaboard. So it's just a way to see the breadth of the archive project by showing 2 slides of each of the artists in the archive project, which was probably numbered like around 400 or something artists then. Yeah.
And Sir is in the audience here with us too today in the second row, and who also to that what you were saying, people would have to come in. This felt like a way of like getting the information out, right? Yeah. Like having the slides circulate as like a traveling exhibition across the different cities, really actually like making it more known the kinds of work that artists were making coming out of the experiences of HIV.
And I guess it's worth pointing out too that this is like really early internet era, so it wouldn't be that you would download images. You would spend all that time to see these images. So being able to see them on slides was kind of the only way you could be introduced to them.
Also, why I also wanted to have Sir's name in the caption here is to also mark the relationships between staff and board at Visual Aids, right?
And-
which is really unique. Maybe you could speak to that as well, because it's nothing like how we think of museum boards today, which we'll also talk about.
Yep.
Like this was an extremely singular ensemble of staff board relations.
I always felt that, and I still feel that Visual Aids is an extraordinary organization. It still exists. It's still working, really doing great projects, and they have a wonderful working board. But it's very different than a larger institution in that the board was not only a working board, but that they were the collective memory, institutional memory of Visual Aid's founding, of artists who they had known, who they were keeping the archives of arts workers that they had known, the founders of Visual Aids, some who had passed on, and of a history, a real cultural history of HIV and AIDS and the way that it intersected with the contemporary art in New York in particular. So the reason that I think that compelled the board and the membership of Visual Aids and the extraordinary volunteers that still make Visual Aids possible were really different than what might motivate a board of directors for a major museum, or even I think, participation of a lot of people in contemporary arts programs. You know, it's a very like social thing to be on a major museum board, and there's just a lot of networking that happens through lots of different organizations and presenting organizations around contemporary art. And with Visual Aids, it was really about memorializing people and people's lives and people's artwork, and memorializing, in a lot of ways, some of the movements that were working to end the pandemic and to save the lives of people living with HIV. And so that's like it's just a different motivation, in the same way that joining Godzilla was a different type of motivation that extends beyond like personal gain. But because there were such deep personal connections of the board or the volunteers to artists and to other people and to activists, it created this incredible web for us to work in as staff. And it felt very much like a support that exceeded the workplace. And, you know, Jeff Hendricks, who's this great Fluxus artist, was the board president for the tenure of my time at Visual Aids, and Barton Benish, this wonderful artist, was on the board, you know, an HIV positive artist. And I remember like at the year-end evaluations, sometimes they would, you know, what was said to me is that we love you, Amy, like we love you and thank you for doing this work. And at that time, I recognized, like, this is not like another type of workplace. Like, I never use the family metaphor for workplaces. Like, everybody has their own family, and, like, that's the point of psychoanalysis. So, like, let's not replicate that in a workplace. Like, a workplace can be like an activist group, where it's a group of people who are working together for common goals, you know, and everybody's doing different things, bringing different roles and bringing different strengths and weaknesses to the table, and that's how you should organize. And I learned that from Godzilla, and I learned that from Visual Aids, and I only ever hoped that I could be the type of leader that the board of directors at Visual Aids was, and to extend a sense of that net of that web to people that I work with.
Do you think you could give an example of like what it was to work with certain board members, or the things that they would go to bat for or do?
I mean, it's very interesting to think about the difference between the board that I had at ICA or the board that I will have at any other museum, who could give you, you know, like $3 million and endow an entire curatorship. And sorry, we just keep pointing you out, sir, but Sir Rodney Sir, who would come to the office and say, like, God, it's really dirty in here. You guys shouldn't have to work under fluorescent lights and with this dirty floor. And so then next week would come back with the mop and rags and wash the floor. So the sense of like support that's very humbling too, and that people would be willing to come together and like do a mailing, back when people used to mail things, or label slides, or go into artists like very cramped studios and take images of their work, and sometimes like help artists like do the dishes or something, you know, like if their studio was literally their apartment. All of those kinds of actions and all of those kinds of acts make up an ethos for a workplace that, you know, like that really motivated me to keep working.
I mean, the kinds of actions you're describing, like now in contemporary curatorial practices, you know, you have organizations like Casco who try to like actually formalize care work within institutions, right? Like, but this is coming from a very different place. You know, you working in 2002 to 2012 with board members who had been on the front lines of care, on caregiving around HIV/AIDS, right? And I remember you mentioning how many of the board members themselves also had like a lot of deep medical experiences working and doing caregiving work and bringing that into the organization. And one thing maybe we could also talk about is, what did it mean for you at the time to try to build an organizational culture in a way, you know, in a context that was also still marked and still continues to be marked by mourning, grief, you know, substance use,
And anger
depression,
and action.
and anger and action.
Yeah.
You know.
I don't think that we thought so specifically, because it was just Nelson and me working together. So there, you know, there were 2 paid staff members for like 7 years, and maybe 7 years into a 10-year tenure at Visual Aids, we were able to hire like a half person, and that half person was Ted Kerr. So we hired half of Ted,
Who's also here.
which is
Hi,
like
Ted.
getting like 3 times, you know, like it's like getting 3 full people, or like 3 full personalities. So I don't think that we thought so much about organizational culture. We did think, you know, like in that very general ethos, it's not just what you do, but it's how you do it. And I think Nelson was always someone who thought from the artist's perspective. So it was never like, great, we're gonna mount this excellent show downtown New York. Well, Nelson would say, well, who are the HIV positive artists? Who are the archive member artists that are gonna be in that show? Like, we're not doing anything without HIV positive people. And how does that impact artists? And so, you know, from the archive project, there were grants that were given to artists, there was emergency grants, there were materials grants, there was the documentation, there was help literally with applications and artist opportunities. But I think Nelson was always this very stalwart advocate for how does this impact artists and where are the artists participating in this. So in that way, you know, the organizational culture became artist focused or artist centered. And we did think about how can we democratize different projects, like say collecting art, which is where Postcards from the Edge, their Visual Aid's major fundraiser comes from. And how do you just, you know, it wasn't the words organizational culture, just like, you know, the word management doesn't really mean a lot to me. Though working with a lot of people requires you to think about how people are motivated and how you get people to kind of come together for a common purpose. And I think that it was more of an ethos about just relationships, so that anyone was welcome into the Visual Aids office. You know, archive members who were like semi-homeless or didn't smell super great could come to the office and talk to us about their artwork. And that we would put down our work to have conversations with people who were maybe struggling with multiple medical issues. And even though we were not legal or medical advice, we could sometimes like pave the way into some of our collegial organizations. But sometimes it was just listening to people too, who had lost a lot, who were sick themselves, who were struggling and making art and really unrecognized. So that kind of way of working and way of being open to kind of wherever artists or people who would come to us would take us. It meant like you ended up staying at till 9 o'clock at night to finish your work, but it talked about a transparency and a willingness to see people in ways that so many other institutions are very closed, and that the walls are really thick and the doors are really heavy to enter into other institutions and to enter into particularly the space where you see how things are done.
And on that note of like seeing how things are done, and also like the different and expanded ways in which you and Nelson and Ted and Visual Aids supported artists, I also just like wanted to mark like the expansion of like opportunities for artists working with visual aids over the years of like the three of you working together. You know, like early on, you know, visual aids had and still does have web galleries, right, for presenting work by HIV positive artists, but also subsequent, and there were conferences that were done on AIDS, art and work, and subsequently, next slide, you know, next slide. I think during the time you all were working together, the sort of formalization of an exhibition space, right, an exhibition program was also something that came to be. Like we've seen that, like with the Lightbox project, there were exhibitions that happened with partnering organizations, but the sort of regularity and commitment and relationship with La Mama was something that you all really forged. Maybe you could speak to that as well.
Well, I think we recognize that, you know, like what do artists need, like sort of in the cycle of what artists need. And it's very basic with, you know, artists who are working on low incomes or fixed incomes. Like they literally need materials, if not space and time to make work. And then, you know, to document the work that's made, and then to be able to share that work. So whether it's artists being able to have their work selected for a web gallery, or in, you know, the ideal situation, being able to exhibit work and then place it into sort of a critical dialogue, and then you need that work to be responded to critically, whether through writing or public programs. And to document that. So these are the sort of cycles that we were thinking of, but it was also the fact that Visual Aid's mission was to use contemporary art and contemporary projects to keep a dialogue going around HIV and AIDS, to keep that in sort of a central focus. And we, you know, wanted to produce actual exhibitions. In fact, Dean Diderco, I remember inviting him to look at the web gallery, or to look at the archive project to do a web gallery, and he looked through thousands and thousands of slides, and then he told me, like, this is great, Amy, but there's like at least 16 exhibitions in this that I can see, and you need to have a real exhibition, and I'll curate for you when you have an actual physical space. And so he didn't do a web gallery, but you know, a year and a half later, Lou Larita and Adriana Farmiga and Matt Nasser from La Mama La Galleria, which is the small gallery connected to La Mama Theater, asked us to do a summer exhibition. And so I immediately thought of Dean, and he put together this great show, which answers one of the problems in the Visual Aids Archive project. You know, like one of the things that you recognize through its lack of women artists being represented there. And so Dean picked 3 men who had died of AIDS who were in the archive project, and 3 women who had all been AIDS activists and who had continued to make work through alongside their AIDS activism, and so showed work from those 3 women sort of over this trajectory of time that traced their involvement with the crisis. This is Nathan's show.
Yeah, Nathan's show. You know, I also just want to mark that, you know, you really supported like almost a generation, right, of like young curators doing queer work around HIV/AIDS as well. You know, with Dean Diderco, you know, Nathan Lee's Undetectable show. You know, later on we'll also see some slides of like the Tainted Love exhibition by Virginia Solomon and Steve Lamb. You know, and so like these were like younger curators who were like doing like research-driven group exhibitions out of the archive, and like that became a platform that was possible. Do you think you could talk a little bit more about supporting them, as well as like supporting these young curators amidst changing conversations around HIV/AIDS?
Yeah,
because the years of your tenure, 2002 to 2012, this is after antiretrovirals become available, but before PrEP, and so this is like a moment of like maintenance, but before prevention. So the conversations are changing, and you see that in like Nathan Lee show, right, where he's trying to theorize like the impact of thinking about bareback sexuality alongside broader theoretical ideas of virality. The show also had some pushback because some of the artists were not, to anyone's knowledge, HIV positive and not always associated with like a sort of queer art discourse, so like this was a show that was challenging on a number of levels, but like you and your colleagues like supported like these difficult conversations as the dialogue on HIV/AIDS was changing.
I mean, I think supporting curators is like an extension of supporting artists, and supporting independent curators or young curators is an extension of looking for and supporting yet under-recognized or, overlooked artists. And I mean, there's overlooked curators too. So it's not about like an age. It's not like all emerging artists are just like, in their 20s or something. So that idea of under-recognition follows when you're thinking about curators. Personally, I support curators too, because once I saw curators really do their work, then I realized, oh, I'm not a curator. Like I'm like an executive director type, like these people really know what they're doing, let their talents flow. Nelson himself is an excellent curator, but he also was sort of the thinking that we would get really interesting exhibitions if we could bring in rotating groups of curators. And what happened when we were looking with more independent, not people who were had positions in museums already, is that they brought their own circles too, of not only artists but attendees. And we really started to see this great intergenerational mix at Visual AIDS. So both a generation of like kind of the first wave of HIV positive people, those who had survived, the AIDS activists, and then this younger generation of queer and trans people who were looking at like a trajectory of queer history and thinking about the way that AIDS impacted their colleagues or mentors or a generation that was kind of missing, that a lot of people were missing, and what was that sort of about? So.
And I think that intergenerational dialogue that like younger curators were really seeking out, right? Like is really also exemplified like in the show by Steve and Virginia. Maybe we can also have like the next slide. You all just saw like a picture of, previously of Fierce Pussy's work installed in both the gallery and outdoors. We also have members of Fierce Pussy behind, or artists behind the artist named Fierce Pussy here today. But also like the work of like younger curators trying to reevaluate work that was very challenging at the moment that it came out, right? Like General Ideas Image Virus was not taken kindly in the art world when it first appeared. And here was Steve and Virginia trying to like rethink what it meant to think about concepts and processes of artistic transmission, through this work and putting it into dialogue with work by other artists that they might have been fighting with at the time that they were making this work, but seeing it from like the perspective like of today.
I think for those of you who aren't familiar with this, the image on the right is General Idea, which is a Canadian collective. The surviving member is A.A. Bronson, and they took Robert Indiana's Love sculpture and made an AIDS, like just use the word AIDS, and then it was sort of virally presented through a lot of public media, and there was a lot of pushback against it. Like, what does this mean? Like, why are you just putting, AIDS? AIDS is not love. What does this mean? And what's missing from this image is the installation of Grand Fury's response, which was to use the AIDS image or the love image and to write riot, really like in this wall-sized piece, which is now, I think, is it permanently installed at the LGBT Center on 13th Street? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Steve and Virginia put them both in the same gallery.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And here we also have a great haircut. Amy and Nelson in their younger days.
Just working in the office.
Just working in the office.
Ivan Monfort's piece. It's the T-shirt that he has that he was. The piece was a lot of different people wearing it.
Yeah, and then it was itself
love and intimacy.
Exactly, and a response to like Daniel Martinez's work in the '93 biennial, which was like a little pin saying, "I can't ever imagine wanting to be white," and he like redid the language in this case. And one of the things that I think is often not seen in art history or exhibitional curatorial history so well is what does it mean to build foundations in an organization or in an institution, right? And like that was something that you and Nelson and Ted were really doing at Visual Aids. You were building foundations for changing the conversation around the relationship between contemporary art and HIV/AIDS. And that work is so often invisible, right? And like some of the work that, has been carried forward when under Nelson's directorship, subsequent to yours as well. Do you think you could speak a little bit about like the sort of foundation building that you did together, but also like what was set up, for like the next phase of like how Visual Aids was operating?
Do you know, when you were talking about this, I was just thinking about like what it was really like to work at, 40, 50, 60 hours a week at Visual Aids in the conditions that it was when Nelson and I first started working together. And it was, it's not like you get to sit around and like push ideas back and forth, like, hey, let's think of a really interesting show to do, or let's think of an interesting artist edition. It was like, hey, let's figure out how to pay the light bill, and like, hey, here's 3 more artists who came in and they're all like, their GMHC appointments are all fucked up. How can we help them when we don't work for GMHC, or we don't, we're not medical attendees, or like, wow, didn't somebody look really thin? This is not good. Like, we should look into seeing if they're like eating lunches. And just like very menial in a certain way, administrative tasks that needed to be done to keep an organization going. And that sort of balanced with the concerns for, people living with this life-threatening illness, and also the responsibility of carrying on the legacies not only of artists who were held in the archive project, but of the founders and all of the people who had worked and volunteered at Visual Aids previously, and then the careers of the artists in the archive project. Like, what are we doing to help them? And so it wasn't like we were consciously making those kinds of organizational decisions. It was pretty scrappy. And I remember for years, as we were working in particular to kind of right the ship financially, and I mean, we're not talking like millions of dollars. It was, I think it was like $100,000 when we got there, and it was like $500,000 when we left, or when I left in 2012. We just had this little book that we sat between our desks, and it was just to like write in and to think about if we had, a Ford grant, or if we could raise $2,000, we would make this kind of artist edition, or we would do this type of publication of books. And it's kind of stunning to see, like, wow, 15 years later, a project like Duets, which is 2 artists from the archive project talking with artists who are not HIV positive, who are not in the project, and comparing their works, come out of Visual Aids, because I mean that was just like one of the things that they lived in, this like notebook that we would pass back and forth. It was like a dream book.
Speaking of building dreams for other people, I was wondering if we could come back to Visual Aids, but also shift a little bit to also talking about the work that you did at the ICA Philadelphia, right, as their executive director, and also bringing some of like the ethos and relationship concerns that you had from Visual Aids to the space of a Kunsthalle museum, a non-collecting museum that typically has like a roster of temporary exhibitions. And in this case, like large-scale international contemporary art exhibitions, a really different type of space, but like you were bringing in a different way of working to this space. Do you think you could talk a little, and I remember you had said before, like when you started at the ICA, you had like certain plans, you had certain thoughts. Do you want to just talk about what it meant to start there?
A mentor and professors who had been a museum director. I remember when I got the job at ICA Philadelphia, I took her to lunch and I was like, well, what do you want? Well, like give me some advice. And she said, plan like how long you want to be there and what you would like to change, what you would like to see when you leave. So I thought, okay, I was at Visual Aids for 10 years. I'm going to be at ICA for 10 years or so. What do I want to do? what would the museum be when I leave? And encouraged by an artist and professor friend, Jeannie Sims, I was like, really, why don't I just dream? Like, just think about that little book, not think about like, I would like it to have a balanced budget. I would like, And that's when I reached for this, what would it feel like to be in a feminist space that was anti-racist and trans and queer embracing and welcoming? What would that feel like to work in? What would that feel like to visit? What would it feel like to be an artist to participate in programs there? And that kind of was the top of my list. And, I don't know yet what it feels like to be there. And what I think that, moving towards that it's really tough. It feels really uncomfortable. It feels like you have to unpeel a lot of your own layers, and you have to be visible and visible in your faults and in your prejudices and in your privileges to your colleagues and to the people that you welcome into the space. So thus far, it's still the goal, and you need to work towards that, but I don't, we're not there yet. And all the changes that were made at ICA in its program, in the makeup of the staff, in who came to ICA, are fantastic, and I hope that they continue on. And I think that would be the same program that I would bring to any museum, and that was to really think about the histories of white supremacy in exhibition history, and to change that, to look honestly and look hard at making sure that women and queer people and trans people and people of color were the ones who were getting the resources to experiment and to make work, and that was being reflected both in our publications and in our public programs, and that is also how you invite people who may not feel like a contemporary art museum space is for them, in particular your local community, which ICA is part of the University of Pennsylvania, which is this private Ivy League institution built in, not unlike, say, Yale and New Haven, built in an African-American neighborhood called West Philadelphia, and how we could invite residents from West Philadelphia, like culturally conscious people who are like really interested in aesthetics or interested in art and culture, to the space when their relationship with the larger organization has been one that's very contentious, of having their neighborhood gentrified and being policed by a separate private police force. So this was like a lot of the thinking that we owed West Philadelphia opportunities to intersect with exciting artists, and how we could build up a trust that our invitations could be taken and experienced. And that sort of fell through every section of the museum, not only from the program, but from the planning of the program, like whose voices are counterbalancing our own ideas about what might be an interesting program, to the experience of visitors literally from the outside of the building to the inside of the building, and how it feels to interact with a building or a museum.
And on that note of like how it feels to interact with a building, but also like the thinking behind the programming, thanks, Alina. Like maybe we can like take a walk through some of like the shows, like that happened under your watch as the director, right? Like Moira Davies' Burn the Diaries exhibition in 2014, curated by Ingrid Schaffner, and then subsequently,
which was a no-brainer.
which
I
was,
remember
like, an
sitting.
incredible
Here's a
show.
story though. I remember sitting with Moira out on the patio of ICA, and she said, "Amy, it's really great to be here. Now, what's your role here?" And I said, like, "Moira, I'm the director." She said, "Oh, wow, you must be the youngest museum director in America."
Amazing. And with that, also Myths of the Marble that Alex Klein curated in 27 in collaboration with
which is
Heini
a great show
Ostad.
and a really wonderful catalog that looks at kind of like the way that artists are looking critically at the uses of AI and virtual reality.
And then the ICA also did some incredible partnering loan exhibitions with external museums, like Naomi Beckwith's The Freedom Principle Experiments in Art and Music, right, that really relocated the post-war neo-avant-garde to actually include histories of Black artists working
Black
with, and
collectives,
Black
yeah.
collectives working with sound and visual culture.
Yeah, and Naomi had been a curatorial fellow at ICA before my tenure,
Yeah.
but she was a curator and colleague that we were all really excited about. And as she moved to the MCA, we asked her to stay in contact with projects that she was thinking about. And she ended up telling us that she was going to be working on this project about Black collectives. And she was teaching a class with our friend Huey Copeland in Chicago about Black collectives. And we had to think through how these Chicago-based collectives would have meaning for Philadelphia. And in particular, what we came up with is that they're driven by AACM and AfriCobra. We're driven by sort of this three-pronged improvisation, collectivity, and experimentation, and that had threads that moved through Philadelphia's art scenes through the 60s and 70s, but also had impact for contemporary artists working now who had extended beyond Chicago.
Amazing.
That show actually was up during the 2012 election, and one of the best
Yeah.
things that I heard from an audience member in the 7 years I was at ICA was the feeling of it being like a balm to come into the space of ICA and to be surrounded by this extraordinary work that comes out of this explosive, collective, improvisational feeling. And you know, we also layered on top of this exhibition a full program, an actual separate exhibition of performances. So to have the gallery filled with music and bodies in a time when I think a lot of us really felt like this wasn't a country for us, there wasn't space for us, was wonderful. And it was great to hear that back from audiences.
You know, and I also think like it speaks to like the kind of opening question that you had going to the ICA Philadelphia. Like I look at the sort of exhibition program that was done, and there's so much more feminist, queer, trans, and people of color space in the exhibition programs and the kinds of collectives that were brought in. The fact that multiple collectives, frankly, were brought in over the years, right, in an exhibition program where typically museums tend to have like a list of like master great artists, geniuses. You know, there's so many collective shows, collectively organized shows that happened under your watch. For instance, like this one put together by Ridiculous, and maybe the next slides. You know, as well as solo shows that were serving the production of women artists that had been under-recognized for a long time by artists who had been working for decades and decades, but also artists who had been working more recently. For instance, Colleen Smith's sort of like early breakout museum show happened at the ICA, you know, and then also amazing group shows, right, that were bringing in together new knowledge by Meg Only, her Speech Acts exhibition, subsequently, the Arms Ache Avid Aeon exhibition, you know, curated by Joey Tang, and also at the same time, next slide, the Color People Time conversation that Meg also did. Next, yeah, which is this one, right? These last two exhibitions like were sort of like multi-stage, multi-chapter exhibitions. Like this one, there was like 3 exhibitions.
No, that's
that
like
was
an
one
interesting, like,
exhibition
temporal,
that happened.
unraveling with these exhibitions. And, you know, I think that ICA was free. It was admission free. And I think even when it had admission, it was very low. But still the barrier is there. And the ethos of being free and being open and available to everyone also impact the way that our programmers and our curators addressed work. So they thought that they could program longer pieces because you could come back. You could go in like for 10 minutes and then come back. And so these unfolding works, like the 3-part Colored People Time, you know, I mean, they function in different ways. Some people are going to see all 3, some people are going to see 1, and so you have to sort of think about how you organize those exhibitions to match different viewers' experience.
Yeah. And speaking of free, I also really also want to mark like what you did financially for the ICA, right? Like there's that enormous 10 million gift, right, towards curatorial research, not just an exhibition, not just public programs, but research, right? Yeah. You secured this huge grant for this huge gift for curatorial research, but you also, which we'll talk about later, also made the ICA the first wage certified museum in the United States, really dedicating the institution to a sort of like payment and salary equity in the arts. Mm-hmm. A lot of times I think American museum directors are understood as master fundraisers, but then at the same time, it's like there's a real question of like what that money is serving, which felt like extremely intentional, political, and thoughtful under your watch.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that the Dan Dietrich gift called the Inchworm Fund was extraordinary. And I mean, you don't meet people like Dan Dietrich every day. He was really much more a poet and an actor than a board member. He had been with the organization for over 40 years, and he really loved artists, and he really felt that the institution's roots were to give artists like a lot of really long lead and a lot of resources to take on great experiments. And through many conversations, we discussed the role of the curator and the relationship between curators and artists that needs to be built over time, that takes months and years even to build sort of a sense of trust, to build out, to ask the right questions, to work together, to find some of those answers, and to see how that might turn into exhibitions. And I think one of the greatest things that Dan said to me after we had organized this gift and nominated it towards curatorial research, and that he made this endowment, and when we were writing it down, he said, this is going to exceed like long after you and I and everyone here is gone, and so we should really think about like artists and curators may need something really different, so let's make this endowment more like a cloud. And, I'm just trying to give you a picture of how extraordinary this philanthropist and artist advocate was. But he also said, Amy, maybe we can't say this publicly if we want to keep fundraising, but, there's going to be curators and artists who ask questions, and they're going to walk down a road, and then they're going to get to the end and just turn around and walk back, and they're not going to have any answers, and there's not going to be any exhibitions. And he said, that's when you give people the chance to experiment, that's the risk you take. And again, it's extraordinary to know that somebody who gave an institution $10 million is saying, by the way, to the director, you're going to see a lot of failure and you're going to have nothing to show for it. So use my $10 million to get there.
Yeah, that's huge.
And I think with the wage certification was a no-brainer for the curatorial team at ICA, who really drove that, and we had always been budgeting to pay artists, and it seemed, when wage was really taken up by a lot of nonprofit arts organizations, but still didn't have a museum who had become wage certified. Our chief curator, Anthony Elms, began actually meeting with Wage and helping understand the ways that museums' budget works. And I've had these conversations with museum directors from around the country, and just to try and tell them that it's not an adversarial position, that it's completely voluntary, and that Wage has the same goals that the museum directors do. So I don't, I expect my colleagues to really follow suit. And I'm surprised that no one else has been wage certified, though some projects have been wage certified. It was an interesting transformation for the museum, and I think it's a little bit about asking those big questions about what a museum would feel like, and me saying that it's like very tough to work in a situation where you're really working for equity across the board. Wage certification also brought up a lot of questions among our staff about salary equity. And we had already set like a floor that no one was working under, like $32,000. But I think you really have to think about what's the minimum like living wage in any given city, and how far from that do you want to be? Like how far away from this is the minimum living wage do you as an organization want to be? And it's the cost of staff is like this, staff and benefits are sort of like a third rail. Like nobody wants to see them go up because they're an everlasting cost, and it's always the largest cost in any budget. But at the same time, like how you say that you want to treat artists equitably, you also have to think about how you can create sustainable workplaces for arts workers.
And I feel like you've thought about that at so many levels, right? You've thought about that for artists, right? The kinds of like payments they would be getting from the institutions. You're looking at that for your staff, your curatorial staff who are leading this conversation with wage and also being impacted. But you were also looking at it for, people on staff who are installers, right?
Yeah.
And like from what I understand, you were actually really proactive in trying to like support like more groups of people who don't typically look like your usual museum installer being your museum installer and making this part of the experience of artists. Do you think you could speak a little bit to that too?
I think that when you put forward that creating inclusive staff and inclusive experiences for anybody who gets to work inside the museum is sort of your charge, then that filters down through a lot. It's like who gets internships, who gets work studies at a place, who gets to volunteer with a place. But I think I was really lucky to work with such a great chief installer and director of curatorial affairs, both of whom really saw their roles as being able to teach people some of the skills that you need to do art installation. And so looked for people of color, looked for women. They were aware, like, oh, look, there's like a lot of like art school graduates, and there are all these boys that are doing the carpentry and the electric for these exhibitions. And so let's bring in other people who have talents and commitments, but who may not have all of the skills, and we'll teach them. And so sometimes I would go down into the galleries as they were being installed, and there would be like a carpentry seminar going on with really great installers. And I think some of the curators worked particularly to make sure that women were well represented on the installation team, which is not the case in most installation teams in museums across the world. To the degree that the Ree Morton exhibition, which was a huge exhibition with a lot of loaned work, millions of dollars of loaned work, was fully installed by women.
That's incredible. I can't say that for many places. I've been monopolizing you for like the last hour, so maybe this is like a moment also for us to check in to see if other folks like have questions or thoughts or comments that they would like to bring up with Amy, or histories that they would like to share, right, that are part of this too, that you would like to also bring in.
There's so many people here that I've worked with and who've seen so much of the work that they know all this. Yeah.
That what's striking me is how the work that you've done in starting with talking about visual aids and thinking about the kind of open door that you had there, and how that really was a location and a place for people, and what space and room you made and provided and built. And then moving on, I mean, there's so much I could say about that. You did so much. Amazing what happened there under your...
With so many amazing people.
Yeah, absolutely. But what happened there wasn't just, it was a practice, and it was rigorous, and it was, these are the things that you did and the ways in which the choices that you made and how you oversaw things there was very mindful and specific, and clearly you brought that and bring that forward. You brought that into the ICA, and these aren't just words and ideas. They're actual. It's a politic and a position that you've taken and put into action, and continue to. And I think sometimes when people do that with such ease, I know it wasn't, or seemingly with such ease and grace as you do, and spirit and generosity, it sometimes you lose that. Oh wait, these are real choices, and this is a real way of being that you're doing and executing, and I just feel very, I think it's very inspiring, and I have a lot of gratitude, and I think it's really amazing.
Thanks. I think that comes a lot from watching people work together, and I feel like something I said when I was beginning at ICA is that, you know, I've learned as much about quote unquote management or leadership from working with and talking with and being mentored by activists as by other organizational leaders. And I think that that's still true, and I kind of approach it as well that everyone's here as though we're working like on an activist project, and how we can bring that spirit to museum work or to nonprofit art work, as much as sort of thinking like through like a business school management position.
Yeah, I'm just highlighting that this is, you know, very intentional.
Thank you.
You know.
Thank you.
Nelson.
Here we go. No, I mean, actually, I wish I had a question. But you're so eloquent about everything that it makes me so proud to work with you. And also, I just want to sort of like call out that like you've always called out everyone else that that you've worked with as an inspiration, but you've been such an inspiration to me, and I know just so many other people as well. Like everything that I've learned of how to treat other people as a director or other positions came from the very direct one-on-one of your concerns of how to make this the best for the individual. And I just want to say thank you for that.
This is like a roast, right?
Any other thoughts? They don't have to be questions, or fully formed for that matter. Andrea?
Well, maybe, I mean, of course, I'm really interested to really think through forward, you know, and to kind of, as you know, this limitation of these institutions, and how the institutional apparatus, you know, even within a kind of university gallery like the ICA, has its limits, and this kind of activism, you know, like I don't know if you, what is the activism that needs to happen in our community to enable more activism within the institutions? I mean, maybe that's a question. I don't know. I mean, I know.
Yeah, I feel really challenged by, I think, what is at stake right now from a lot of audiences and the ways that they view museums. I mean, I think that I have, there's limits to what I think museums sort of need in terms of growth that becomes sort of overwhelming or kind of cancerous, like this just keep growing idea, and especially building and taking up like space this way. At the same time, I'm acutely aware of the limitations of funding structures for museums in the US and for opportunities to share art with publics. And so the issues around and the protests around toxic philanthropy are very real, and I wonder in, you know, what context ICA could be protested or being just simply challenged about where the money comes from. You know, I think that the Penn students are challenging where the money comes from, and that it's not their tuition, but it's these $1 million gifts that are coming in from alumni and other people. And I think that the next museum that I lead could also be questions about, you know, how far into do you want to go of where money comes from. And part of that also, you have to think like, what is somebody getting from this, from making these gifts? Is that actually enough to say that the gift should be declined? And I often think about a friend who, when we were talking about taking pharmaceutical money around HIV/AIDS cultural production, and some people on this panel that we were with were really hardline, absolutely not. The pharmaceutical companies are the problem. They're profiting from people's health and people's deaths, and they get to own everything that says HIV and AIDS. Like, they just get their name on everything. So we would never take their money. And another friend who I find very wise said, you know what though, but isn't it like all our money? And shouldn't we be able to do what we consider good work with that money? Difficult. I don't have like an opinion on it yet. Like, but I think that it's important. I think that that's part of the activism there. I think part of the activism around museums too is like showing up, is like kind of leaving our own like comfortable place on the couch with our, you know, Instagram or something, and showing up and sharing space with people that we don't know, and being willing to talk with people that we don't know. And I think what is beautiful about museum settings and nonprofit art settings and places where art exists, whether it's performance or music or physical work, is that it gives us an opportunity to triangulate conversations with people who are so unlike us. So it doesn't really matter like where your grandmother's from, where my grandmother's from. We're talking about this work here and what it's transmitting and what it's telling us, and what possibilities it's opening up. And so it's like being on the subway, you know, but with a focus. It's like being on a subway when something's going wrong with the subway. Yeah. so it's going right. Yeah. Thank you all.
Any last burning question? Yeah, Gabby.
Process went, and sort of like how you orient yourself in like honoring the past, like but making it present, and then like making space for the future, because that like historical intersection of art and history is like sort of a complicated one to try to entangle and like honest. I'm just wondering if you could talk about that process.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it was like an ongoing process. So the archive project was founded really separately from visual aids, and then became a visual aids project really early, like in the late 80s. And it continues to be this central focus at Visual Aids. It's a way of both documenting the impact of HIV on cultural production, but it's also literally just documenting individual artists' works because we think that they're important. And what's great about the archive project and unusual about it is that it's completely uncurated. So no one's making distinctions like this work deserves to be documented and historicized. This work doesn't. If you're HIV positive, thank you, or you're the estate of an artist who has died, the work is available as long as the resources are available there to be documented and to be held in the archive project. And so it continues to grow. But you know, that uncurated aspect of the archive project raises really interesting questions in the same way like we're talking about culturally specific organizing. You know, like what does it mean for Asian Americans to say like, oh, you know, like we're in the same boat together because we're Asian American artists, when maybe our work has nothing to do with each other, like it really couldn't be compared. And so because it's an uncurated archive, or because it's an uncurated project, you have work from any possible realm being shown together, and artists that have nothing in common other than their sero status being shown together. And I think that it raises really interesting questions and creates interesting frictions more so than divisions.
Yeah.
I had a question about the curatorial decision on how to display the slides. I was wondering why you chose to display them on light boxes rather than slide projectors.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't curate that show. It was something I inherited, but you know, I think that that's really, we were always collecting slide projectors at Visual Aids because they're sort of out of, they're, you know, running out of production, and we would often display things with slide projectors. There was something about the experience of looking directly at the slide as opposed to, I think, the projection of the image and the intensity that you have to kind of get up on it with a magnifying glass or a loop, that seemed like it was really special about that kind of light box. And it was about I think taking the experience of looking through thousands and thousands of slides in the office and being presented with this kind of stained glass looking object, that as you get up on it, you start to see the detail and all of the reveal that each of the documentations is sharing. And it becomes a little overwhelming, too, of how many works there were that might not be as apparent in a projection.
I would also just add, and Sir could correct me if I'm wrong too, but one of the ideas of the Lightbox exhibition is that we didn't show it just in gallery spaces, but we also showed it like in the hallway of Planned Parenthood or whatnot. And so there's just limitations of like being able to set up a light projector in a hallway space or whatnot as well too.
I mean, I know that and the idea of having a very flexible installation plan was why the light boxes were like the length that they were. It wasn't just like one giant light box, so that they could be spread around on different floors of a building. And again, as Nelson said, so that it wouldn't just be limited to arts exhibiting spaces, but it could be in cultural centers or libraries or universities or even healthcare spaces.
These are really good questions, y'all. Any more?
Yes, I'm interested I know you're not as like connected in like the current visual aids organization, but given that, so I was like doing research for visual aids, like archival fields and there, and learned a lot about like the first few years, and then hearing about like all of what was happening while you were director. I'm wondering if like you have any like hopes or dreams of like the future of visual aids, or also just like you spoke a lot about like forms of access, like regarding that and like the work that you're going to do.
I mean, I think like going back to the like notebook of dreams, the dream notebook that Nelson and I had, like a lot of them have come true, and a lot of the work that Visual Aids is doing now is work that was always in the forefront of what we were trying to get done, like intersecting more with women, with HIV positive women. And I think that the Love Positive Women project from Visual Aids is extraordinary. You know, it's like a paper making project that then makes Valentines for positive women around the world. From positive women. So it's not a matter of like people really saying like, oh, I'm an artist, but that art making is a part of their process too. Or I think looking at some of building that kind of cultural history of AIDS activism. I think that Visual Aids has continued to do that. And so I'm really like excited by the ways that what was started when Nelson and I were there has expanded and started to touch realms of places around HIV and AIDS that we always knew needed to be addressed, but somehow we couldn't reach while I was there.
Yes.
So I know that West Philly and like University City have like a fraught relationship.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. So I was just curious as to like what were your approaches when you were in that position to like reach out to the community, because I know that can be a very hard thing, and Temple's going through it now as well. So
it's like just tons of different things, and you try everything. But one of it is showing up in West Philadelphia and not like waiting for people to come to your museum, but showing up at their places, at their community meetings, at their arts organizations, like at their block parties, and just being a presence. I think that a lot of communities, particularly communities of color, are really used to being tokenized by institutions, by cultural institutions. Like it's like Cinco de Mayo, so let's go talk to some brown people, or it's like Chinese New Year, and so what I established with my team was, we make partnerships, and we do those over time and in depth. And so we would work with the same organizations year over year. And one of the most successful things that we did was to really cede control of curatorial work and programming so that we were collaboratively programming events, evening events, and ICA would cover like all the costs and like kind of staff up to make sure that the events were produced and ran in a way that we felt really proud of with community organizations. So Louse in the House would get to create the New Year's project, you know, that they always wanted inside and all over the museum, and serve like a New Year's dinner, and also run gallery tours. So that was really important. But I think that the idea of creating partnerships and building trust and doing that again and again over time was probably the most effective thing. I mean, I went so far as to create a whole department that was very much about being public facing for the organization. And I was hoping, and I hope that it still gets there. And I think it's an issue of like every director's kind of working at this, seeing that department, the public facing department, start impacting the curatorial and programmatic department, so that those conversations would go both ways, not just information from curators and programmers, but information from audience and audience's advocates.
We probably have to let go of the room at this point, but like, thank you so much for that question on showing up. It's so necessary. Thank you, Amy.